So we go to the next group of, it's more a Q&A, we say. It will be moderated by Stephanie. Stephanie Steinmetz will be there together with Mark Anna. Mark, are you there? Where's Mark?
Yes, I'm here.
Mark?
I'm looking for my mute button.
Good. You're there too. And you're visible, I'm sure. Simon Deakin and Janine Leschke. So I leave the floor for Stephanie Steinmetz. And each time you want to discuss, to ask something, use also the chat box to discuss. I have the feeling, meanwhile, that the Q&A is not used, which is not a drama because the chat box is working perfectly. So let's focus on the chat box. As soon as Q&A still works, then we do that. Stephanie, welcome. You have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Pauline. I'm very honored to be moderator of this very interesting session. We have a highly esteemed panel with experts, I would say, on index creation. I'm curious about your opinions. And as Martin before, I want to very briefly introduce the panelists. We have, as a starter, Mark Anna. He's a professor of labor and employment relations and political science at Penn State. He's also the founding director of the Center for Global Workers' Rights and its related master program. And this is also part of, if I understand it correctly, the Global Labor University Network. A second panelist will be Simon Deakin. He is professor of law and the director of the Center for Business Research at Cambridge University. And he is really a specialist in the empirical and economic analysis of law, and as well a co-author of the CBR-led Matrix database of labor, company, and insolvency laws. And finally, we have Janine Leschke. She is professor with special responsibilities in comparative labor market analysis at Copenhagen Business School. I'm very curious about your statements. I will directly move to Mark. The floor is yours, 3 minutes. And yeah, let's start.
Sebastian, you're on mute. Yeah.
Okay, got it. I'll eventually figure this out. How to do this. It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you all for this, and congratulations for all this incredible hard work. Partly time is so short. I just very quickly say, what I think is just an important contribution to this. Say very quickly what we're doing at Penn State, and then maybe offer just some suggestions or tips that I take away from all of this. So I think 3 things really stand out for me for the contribution. And as was just mentioned, it's open access. I think this is so crucial that not just academics who have subscriptions and things, but worker rights groups around the world can have access to it. It provides very detailed information. We're talking a lot about wages, but there are other indicators in there related to social policy, which I think are so crucial. And the last thing I want to say, and I say this is from a limitation for what we're doing on our side, it's very up to date. This hard work to constantly keep things up to date. So if you're doing this work, you really have to have the latest data. So my congratulations to you on that. Let me go pop down 2 slides maybe for me. I'm going to show you now what the next one. Yeah. So this is what we have. These are labor rights indicators. We launched this about 5 years ago at Penn State. So we really went deep into the labor rights indicators side. So we're missing all the other things you're doing, and we give up 2 things by doing that. We don't have the wages and so on. It takes us longer to get these up to date, but I'll just say what we are doing here, what it does offer. We have 108 criteria. Our scale, a normalized score is 10 points, but down to 2 decimal places. We use 9 different sources. They're listed all the way over to the right, 6 ILO sources, national legislation, ITUC report, and US State Department report. We do have in law and in practice, we do weight this. So just a quick point, if a unionist gets shot in Colombia, it's a high weight. If someone gets detained for an hour, it's a different weight. So we think the weighting is important. So that's our project. Let me maybe the next slide. just to say what happened with this. So we developed, again, going back 5 years, we were working on this. This has now been pulled into the ILO as a simplified source. There's no in-law and in-practice definition, and it only uses ILO sources. And this now has been the benchmark for Sustainable Development Goal 8.82. And in fact, the language there builds from the website and the way we built the data set originally. So if you can now pop back up 3 slides, and I know I'm just, so here go, no, one down there. So this is the labor rights. This is your score. So you have 4 different indicators there. It's dichotomized, yes, no. And I just think, again, it's up to date. It's, you know, we're still a couple of years behind. This is just a fantastic contribution. The 3 things I would say: consider the weighting, which is what Kathleen said, is really, I think, makes an important difference. I know it's tricky, but if you can, with time, it takes time, bring in practice and not just in law. And lastly, just my gut impression, yes, no, right to strike, and so on, maybe even consider a 3-point scale so you get some more nuances. You're seeing a lot of countries there that are getting 100% for those 4 indicators, and maybe a 3-point scale might give us a little bit more nuance that could be useful. So let me stop there. Thank you very much. And again, my deepest congratulations. Very impressive work.
Thanks a lot, Mark. Very good suggestions, I think, for the further planning. I will now give the floor to Simon.
Yeah, hello everybody. It's very nice to be able to take part in this webinar. Congratulations to the authors, Pauline, Iftikhar, and others of this tremendous, these 2 tremendous data sets. I greatly appreciate the amount of work that goes into creating an index of this sort. It's a really huge effort and is absolutely needed, because we are very much in need of data, I think, about labour laws in a form which can be used by social scientists in particular when it comes to evaluating the effects of labour laws. That was the main motivation behind the Cambridge Index. We wanted to get a better grasp of the economic and social effects of labour law over time. So our index is really a historical one that goes back to the 1970s. We now have 50 years worth of data. We're just about to produce a new version of our index. The one online at the moment goes up to 2013, but we're hoping to publish a version up to date to 2020 in the next few months. We've been doing the work on that during the COVID emergency. It's one of the things we have been able to do. I think that each index is different. That's the one point I'd like to make, that there's no one way to create an index, and one has to very carefully look into the founding assumptions of any particular indicator, I think, to see how it was constructed and to get a grasp of what the authors were really trying to achieve. We don't maintain that our index is a unique way to describe labour law. There are assumptions which are built into it, which we think are defensible, but which do have to be fully taken on board when the data are being used. We hope that it's accurate, given the assumptions that we start off with, and we wonder always if other indices like the OECD one are actually accurate. The only way you can really tell whether an index is accurate is by doing what the authors of these indices do, which is to provide the sources. If you can't go back to the sources and you can't trace where the coding comes from, it's very difficult to make any real progress in understanding what the data are doing. The principal indices relied on by social scientists are created by big international institutions like the World Bank and the OECD. They're very largely taken on trust. We always are interested and intrigued when our scores differ so radically as they do from the OECD one. And sometimes it's possible to see why, and on other occasions not. The work done by Raphael Laporte, Andre Schleifer and their colleagues actually can be reverse engineered very well. We did that, but that's not always the case with some of these other indices. You can't always reverse engineer them to see where the scores came from. There must be transparency. One last point though, there will be errors, and we've absolutely been clear that since we coded 117 countries for 50 years, there are going to be, let's say, errors, or at least disagreements maybe over how the scorings are arrived at. We published our data online over the many years it's taken to get to this point, and labour lawyers will write to me and say, we don't agree with your coding, or we think that's wrong. And where that's the case, we will change the coding. So we say, making it public, making it transparent, sourcing it. There's a 1,000-page practically long source book related to our data set, so you can see where we got the coding from. If we made a mistake, we'll correct it. We would say there's an inbuilt error correction mechanism there. If it's not right, we'll change it. Okay, and you just have to be honest about this. Mistakes are going to be made. You know, you're dealing with tens of thousands of data points, and it's a massive, massive job. So over time, different indices will have different approaches. We'll get a better sense of the evidence. I would, to go back to the point made right at the beginning, I'm in favor of a rich and diverse ecosystem, not just one way to create these data sources.
Thanks a lot, Simon. I think a very important point, the transparency, and I would like later on in the discussion to come back to it. But let's first hear Janine.
Yes. Thank you very much for the invitation. Also from my side, you can just move on to the first slide. And big congratulations. It's really an enormous endeavor you're out for. And I'm going to focus exclusively on the labor rights index. I just wanted to give you a bit of brief context, I guess, why I've been invited. When I was at the European Trade Union Institute many years ago, a colleague of mine, Andrew Watt, and I kind of endeavored on trying to capture job quality in an index in a multidimensional way. And you see some figures here of the latest outcome of that index, and they were, or the data was collected, and the report was produced by Agnieszka Piasna, who took over my job in Brussels. So if you check that source, you'll find kind of all the publications on the European Trade Union Job Quality Index. And essentially we do something similar. We have sub-indices. We do not rate them to kind of come, and this doesn't show very nicely on the slide, by the way, to come to the overall job quality index. But indeed, if you're interested, just kind of go and check the source link. You can move on, because what I want to do, I want to focus, of course, on the labor rights index. And there's some recommendations in a very nice article by Munosti Bustillo and colleagues on how to model job quality in a multidimensional way. And of course, you can also go beyond job quality here. And I think when checking these criteria, the labor rights index is doing pretty well. So I think it's definitely a good idea in terms of making policy recommendations to go for a multidimensional index. It's also useful, even though there is discussions about this, to provide a cumulative index side by side with these sub-indices. So this kind of can make the argument stronger. It makes it easier to benchmark countries, to look at developments over time. Of course, we need clear definitions. We need to be transparent. This has already been touched upon, and I think you're doing already a very good job there. There's probably kind of ways to go further on this. Also, one of the statements in that article is that if possible, it's better to use results rather than procedures as input indicators, even though you might have kind of good reasons to go for labor law too. However, one of the points I was realizing when I looked in particular at Denmark, because I'm based in Denmark, and some of the other Nordic countries, collective bargaining is not captured very well at all. And I was a bit sad to see that some of the scores were 0, just simply because things are not codified in law, but in collective bargaining. Like the right to collective bargaining, there was just a 0 for some of the Nordic countries. The right to flexible working in cases of family needs, it was just a 0 because it's not in law, it's in collective bargaining. So I think this is quite a sensitive issue potentially when you look at a subset of countries. Yeah, overall it might not matter, but if people are interested, let's say in the European Union and then in the Nordics and some of the other countries, this might be an issue. And there's the recommendations that one might want to limit attributes to those directly related to the job itself. So again, there's discussions about if social security should be there, but I think you have a really good kind of reason to have it in there. It's of course related to the decent work agenda. So I think that's not an issue as such. I also think you really do focus on jobs. And I found it really useful actually that you have these quick fact sheets that open up. And just one very small recommendation, you also want to include the total labor force and percentage in there. I think you have it for women, but then you just give like an overall figure. I was a bit more uneasy about the general assumptions that you have in there in the video. I really didn't quite understand the aim of it, especially because you then have kind of sub-indices looking at basic labor protection for gig workers. You have fixed term contracts in there. So for me, there was a bit of a mismatch. So maybe just something to discuss again or to look into. I have a last slide. I might be running out of time. Then you just let me know and I can take it up in the discussions. So again, and this is again an article that we wrote and where we try to kind of flag up challenges in building European job quality indices. So you can also check that article. And I kind of tentatively try to apply it to the labor rights index. And I think, again, it's extremely impressive that you're doing this for 115 countries and even want to kind of go beyond that. We did it only for 28 EU countries and already thought it was really a challenge, even though we have pretty good data available for these countries. One positive point potentially, do you really need to update this every year? I can see in times of crisis, it might make sense, but in a way, kind of job quality and some of these dimensions are relatively slow moving targets in normal times, yeah? So it might potentially not be necessary to kind of update this every year, but there's of course discussions to be had on this. Weighting was mentioned already by several colleagues. I think many academics in the job quality kind of swear, they say like, well, it might be better not to weight, as it's more transparent in a way if you don't do that. So I think you need to be really sure about the sub indices, about the indicators in there if you start to weight things. Otherwise, I think it's more transparent actually to not weight, and then people can kind of put weights on certain things themselves. But I think this is a big discussion. So I mean, I think you'll keep on discussing this, and some of the other panelists have been mentioning this. I mentioned already the decisions what to do with missing values, and here I kind of use the collective bargaining, which might be functional equivalent. I mentioned that already of labor law. And the last point I have is, of course, the choice of subdimensions and indicators within the subdimensions is crucial. Again, I think you're quite clear. Your component indicators on labor rights index are driven by decent work agenda. It's comprehensive, it's to the point, but of course one could, for example, imagine if you go to the sub-dimension of, and that's my last point, family responsibilities, where you have 1 week of paternity leave, where you get then a score of 20 points. But you have some countries where you have earmarked father's leave, and these countries might actually score 0, even though they have something that, again, acts as a function equivalent here. And again, it's a small point, but I think it's pretty important to be aware of this. And this is just one example I wanted to put in there. And I think there were a few others that I stumbled upon, but having my very kind of small-minded focus on EU countries. And sorry for being too long and too fast, probably. I'm done.
Janine, thanks a lot. I think it's very good to have this kind of inspirations and critiques. So I think it's always nice to have everything is fine and great job, but it's also important, you know, like that we learn and get some inspirations for improvement. So thanks a lot for that. I just want to check, are there any questions from side of the audience? I don't see anything from side of the chat. So probably I will just open the floor with the question I have. And is there a possibility how we can, you know, like join forces again? How can we make it more complementary? How we can learn from each other? I think what Simon said in terms of transparency, I think this is, of course, very important, but also here for me, an issue is I always think about, okay, I'm creating this index, so I have a huge framework how I do this, but on the other hand, we have also to think about the users and to be transparent towards the users, which one is the best index. This relates also to what Rob has said at the beginning, you know, like we have users who want to use it, and now we have like 120 indices and they have to choose which one is the best. So I'm wondering how we could make this more, let's say, transparent and harmonized in a way that users also have a better guideline for what can we use, which index, on which grounds. Can we simplify it maybe? Because what Simon was saying, like a 1,000-page compendium, how you coded it will be probably quite, yeah, for a user quite, oh my God, I'm not going to do this and read it. So I'm just wondering what do you think? So first, how can we, let's say, collaborate or synergize things together? How can we collaborate? And the second one is how can we, let's say, yeah, increase this transparency without being too overburdenful? How can we make it more like, how can we make people aware what is a good index versus what should they consider as a good quality index? I'm not sure what to go for. Yeah, Simon.
To say that I think that labor law is very complicated, you know, so our source book is 1,000 pages, but it's summarizing tens of thousands, obviously, of pages. Sure. And it's as long as it is, you know, so you can go to an individual country, which may be like 2 pages or 3 pages, and then see how the labor laws were coded over time. It's still very, very simplistic in a sense. And there's a danger of people looking at a source like that and treating it as in some way a substitute for going back to the original text, which they shouldn't really do if they want to research labor law more deeply. I think that it depends who the users are. Okay, so I think if you're producing an index for economists and statisticians to use in a rather technical sense for doing econometric research, that's one type of thing. And you can be absolutely sure that they will spend all the effort needed to understand exactly how the data set was constructed and will use it in a particular way. For policymakers and multinational enterprises, for companies, again, one would want to have a dialogue with them. You know, so if sometimes international agencies approach us from time to time to say, can you please produce data for us, update your data set, explain to us how you produced it. That's really needed. So I would encourage this type of dialogue to go on. And when it comes then to the media using indices to construct league tables, that I'm not in favor of. And I noticed that Pauline was saying, I think right at the start, or maybe the narrator of the film said, okay, the data sets are not being used to create league tables very much. Well, quite right too. You know, league tables are really quite problematic because often we're not comparing the same thing. And to say that a certain system has a burdensome labor law regime or a light labor law regime, well, these are political normative judgments very often. And it's actually quite risky to construct league tables around indices which are not, as I said, the unique way in which one might produce or present data.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Janine? Or
yeah, just a very short comment. I mean, I try to kind of look at all the data and indices available and on the kind of European level on just kind of social issues at some point, and it was mind blowing. So, and this was just for the EU. So I think for kind of a normal user, it's impossible almost to kind of use these issues. I was wondering, but I don't know how feasible that is. If one could potentially just have a page on the website as everything is nicely available and just kind of include some kind of key links to other key resources that might be beneficial to kind of look at for some of these sub-dimensions. And I was, again, because my focus was on the EU, and when I kind of saw this family index, or sorry, family responsibility index, I think I was like, okay, maybe it would be useful here to just kind of have also a link to the OECD family database, which then of course is not as comprehensive, but for people who are interested in a certain set of countries might be useful to kind of give additional information. So maybe something fairly simple as such might be useful, but I think it's mind-blowing. I mean, I'm very limited in my worldview, as you can see, but even there. But I think it would be useful. Yeah, very short.
Thank you. Mark, you also have some suggestions.
Yeah, no, this is all, it's just so fascinating. I'm still, soaking it all in. This question with transparency, I think there's different ways to look at it. And I think if I understand some of the earlier comments, it's for us, it's about transparency of how we code it. So you actually, if you click a violation, the original law comes up and you could read it and you could say, oh, we think you didn't code it properly. But we have, so that was more work than coming up with the number, was actually uploading. And it, so that's one thing. But another observation to make too, and I just having been in this so deeply for the last several years, we're coding pre-existing documents. Like some people say, well, you coded, I don't know, Venezuela too high or too low. We're not flying right to Venezuela and interviewing people. We're studying the ILO decisions. And if one of the problems that happens is if a country, if the unionists, for example, aren't presenting a lot of complaints to the ILO, there aren't rulings on them that you can then read and code. So there is a problem. There's certain things that come in that we have to be aware of. The last thing I would say, I think this is an interesting discussion on waiting, whether to wait or whether not to wait. I think added to it, if you were to do it, the question is how to do it and how to do it in such a way that doesn't introduce bias. What we did, and the hard work is always setting it up in the beginning. We used this Delphi method, which was, there were three of us, David Kuchera, if you know, Dora, sorry, myself. We came up with a list of 27 experts, and we worked so hard to make sure there was from Africa, from Asia, women, men, a whole diversity of experts. And we sent them our 180 criteria and said, please code this. on a scale. Then we gave it back to them for revisions. So the weighting wasn't done by us, it was done by a diverse international group of coders. If you go that way, then, it's not something you want to do quickly and so on. It's either, I think, go all in and do it rigorously, and I'd be very happy to discuss, collaborate on how we did it, to share that if that's useful. So those are just some reflections.
Thanks a lot. I think, Pauline, you also had a remark.
Well, maybe what would be, that's what you can do now in such a group. Mark, maybe it's very, very good to talk with Evert Verhulp from the Amsterdam University Law School to discuss together with him and with Iftikhar Ahmad. Iftikhar Ahmad, you see, so we could do that today, but also after, to see how to collaborate, but also to make it smarter, not for ourselves, but for users, and users in this case also, let's say, workers or trade unions, because more, let's say, more indexes, more databases doesn't make per se people happy. It only makes them happy if you can use it right away. And from our point of view, we think it should be up to date all the time. So up to date, after 3 years, it's so up to date, needs to be up to date. A new law means you have to integrate it. New minimum wages, you should integrate it, of course, because it's used by users and they can't live with old stuff. But let's try and set up a meeting, let's say in a similar context. We can invite others to discuss as well how to do this smartly, to integrate. To integrate online is always very easy, but truly to integrate is something else. And then, so of course, first step is to integrate with links to the other indexes, but integration, I would love to.
Thanks a lot, Pauline. Yeah, I think this would be nice if we could establish a collaboration in that respect and learn from each other and, how we can make it work and then harmonize more. I think there's now a question in the chat. I think from Daniela, there is adding collective bargaining provision to the labor rights index. How would you see them included? When a provision is in the labor law, we are sure it is in a law. For collective bargaining, the provision could be given in one collective agreement, but maybe not in another one. I think, Janine, that's probably something for you.
Absolutely. And I think that's an absolutely fair point. And this is maybe also why you decided not to do it. And you could say, okay, there's a threshold. So if it's at least 50% or 60% be included, because even if it's in the law, we don't know if there's compliance. So it might be in the law, but there might not be compliance. And again, I think here I'm a bit colored by being in the Nordic countries, and you'll always get that message. And Kathleen also remembers that from being at the ETUC. It's like, oh, but you have to look at collective agreements. But I think it's true in a way that if Nordic scholars were to look at the index and were to see like, okay, here we get a 0 score, even though we know it's 70, 80%, having this right through collective agreements, then it's just simply not very useful. So either you kind of try to include it in a way or another and having kind of a threshold, or you at least kind of make a comment, but in this country, we have collective agreements that actually take care of this. So to give some kind of context information so that people don't just see the 0. Yeah, so I think that's my brief comment on this.
Okay, thanks a lot. Are there any further questions from the audience? If not, I have another one. And I think in the videos, it was clear that, of course, this is work in progress. We are still, we are already thinking about what could be improved, what could be the next step we have. There were several things mentioned, like that we increase the dimensions we are looking at, that we are looking, that we also think about atypical workers, because this was also criticized before that. At the moment, we have a clear definition of the worker we are looking at. And the question is, what would be your hinge of, so where should we go? What should be important dimensions you would consider? And in terms of, let's say, the atypical worker, do you see there is kind of a need, for instance, what we heard before, to focus also more, let's say, highlight gender inequalities more, focus more on the informal labor market? What would be your advice in that respect? Anybody wants to go first?
Well, I think it's an interesting question. We take a different approach in our index. We don't say we're just focusing on the full-time permanent contract, but the question we want to address is what's the nature of the labour law system a bit more generally in a country, and how far does it, for example, regulate employer choice on so-called more flexible forms of work? How far does the employer get to determine if you're self-employed, that kind of thing? Again, with something like collective bargaining, I think you just have to be clear about what you want to do. So we said, well, we will include norms derived from collective agreements where they are very functionally similar to labour laws. So in the case of the Nordic systems, we did say that we would code for certain national level collective bargaining agreements in Denmark, for example, on things like job security, which were not in legislation, but which we understood to be de facto binding on individual firms, at least as far as we could tell, very close to having a kind of jural or labour law effect. You have to do that because otherwise you end up with a very distorted picture. But these are just assumptions that one has to spell out as clearly as possible, I think, in the surrounding contextual documentation. It would be very misleading to try to estimate the effect of labour law in the Nordic systems without taking account their distinctive features. You know, again, and not just there are plenty of specific features one would want to try to build in. It's really for the researchers to make these judgments, and they have to draw upon their own knowledge, their own expertise, I guess, and maybe understandings in the relevant field about how labour law operates in practice. All these things get somehow built into an index, and they just have to be clarified, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you.
Maybe very briefly on this, and I was also wondering if you cross-checked every single kind of country then with at least one country expert researcher or whatnot, and then you could get some insights on did we miss out on something. So this could be a first easy way in, because of course you're not going to go and check all the collective agreements in the kind of national languages and so forth. You did ask about atypical workers, and I'm very much interested in atypical workers, but I think on the one hand side you've already partly included them, even though you have this assumption that kind of tells us something a bit different. And I'm also wondering, at least again, from my European perspective, for part-time workers, many of these rights, unless they are kind of on very short hours, would be pretty similar. So they would actually be included, but that might just be for the European Union also because we have directives there and so forth. So I'm not sure what exactly you want to do, but I'd be interested in having a dialogue if you think this could be useful in the future, if you get some clearer ideas, because it's definitely a field I think I could contribute to, but at the moment I'm a bit uncertain how to contribute.
I'm still asking that same question. What's the best way to collaborate? But I just want to focus on this collective bargaining point, because I do think it's important. Just a couple of things that come to mind. Like in our work, we realized one of the biggest areas was the public sectors, and you're not including, right, the public sector. So and we get into the weeds, like, do firefighters have the right to form a union? Do police officers have a right? We get into all the different things. If there were restrictions, that would have affected your score, but you don't have that. The other is, more it's the question of how you code it. So I know, like, you'd have some country in Latin America for a while, the law said you have the right to collective bargain. To do so, you need 75% of the workers to vote, in favor of bargaining. So, this gets in the question of what the ILO, which would kind of come in on this normative approach. This is an unreasonable threshold, right? Just like forming a union, you have a right to form a union, but you need, 100 workers, or you need 50% plus one, or even saying you need 35 workers. So I just get into so that's, do you get into that level of detail? Is just the first one, you have the right to form a union, or do you actually look at the right to bargain, the threshold, and maybe that threshold condition is unreasonable, and that would affect the coding.
Thanks a lot. I think, Pauline, my time is up. I would like to thank the panelists for this very interesting discussion, which has to be continued, I think. And Pauline.
It looks like, yes. I think it's maybe not tonight, but at least from Monday on, we quickly should talk and to go to a new level of perfection, where obviously we said, well, we do as many countries as possible, because we have the feeling that also in Togo, people are living there and they need to respect not only Europeans, but in any country, whether it's small or big. So we took another take. But by collaboration, we might have a good index for everybody instead of only for, let's say, people in Europe or in the US or in big countries or so. So I'm very happy so far with the discussions and the feedback. I think it's brilliant. And I see Iftikhar, and I'm sure he's quite happy with it as well. So now, thanks a million, Stephanie.